You're fine.
All right. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the Trek for Truth, which was a cross-country hiking and biking odyssey to try and raise awareness for Lyme disease, among a lot of other topics. And for those of you that know me, you know this is the second kind of big project, advocacy project that I took on. Marrying something that I love, the outdoors and hiking and biking both, with something I'm very, very passionate about, and that's trying to dispel the lies that are being told about this Lyme epidemic and get facts and truth out there in whatever way, shape, or form I'm capable of, and hopefully reach some people that may be able to avoid dealing with this disease, from getting accurate information, respond to this disease much more quickly and effectively if they are bitten because they've got accurate information, and hopefully equip non-Lyme folks with the information that could help us respond to this sweeping worldwide epidemic in a much more effective way than has been going on. So a couple of years ago, after I started to get some of my health back, a good part of the physical health after more than a year of treatment, I took a crack at hiking the 2,000+ mile Appalachian Trail. And then I got sick again in 2014, still some lingering Lyme symptoms, but I think the majority of my illness after I finished the Appalachian Trail hike had to do with still a suppressed immune system. And I picked up some parasitic infections on the Appalachian Trail that my body just wasn't able to fight off as well as, you know, a healthy person could. And I think it's really likely that I still had other levels of pathogen load. Borrelia, Bartonella were the two that I primarily dealt with, that, and viruses that could have easily been reactivated, as most of us that have been dealing with these milieu of illnesses know. Another blow to your immune system, and you can see illness manifest itself again. So it's really important to try and maintain the terrain, as some people would call it, the body, the mind, and the spirit, to not only recover your health, but to maintain it. And once I finally started to turn the corner again in 2014 and start to regain some of my health, I knew I wanted to do something even bigger than the Appalachian Trail was, and that's where I came up with the idea to try and walk across the United States to raise awareness for Lyme. Not just Lyme, and anybody that's visited our website, Trek, T-R-E-K-F-O-R, truth.org, trekfortruth.org. You'll see on that website a lot of other information that includes Lyme disease, but goes beyond it too, kind of the greater macro environment that honestly is, I believe, is allowing an epidemic like this to propagate to the level that it is, that defies all logic and reason. It just doesn't make sense once you understand how devastating this epidemic is. The marginal response that's taking place at an organizational level, governmental level. Doesn't make any sense at all. So a lot of what we talk about on the website is about that. But a lot of what I tried to talk about across the country on this Trek for Truth, and wound up covering about 4,150 miles. About 1,100 of it I walked from the Atlantic Ocean in Delaware, starting the day after my 55th birthday on April the 18th. Walked back here to Louisville, Kentucky, backpacked, and then switched over to a bicycle and rode a bicycle 3,000 miles from here to the Pacific Ocean just south of San Francisco. A lot of what I talked about with people that I met was really about physical healing, mental healing, and emotional and spiritual healing. And even though these projects were about advocacy, for me personally, what I took away from them was really a personal experience of healing, and trying to offer that back up to people and have a dialogue about what is really healing and where are we out of balance as individuals, and even taking a look at what are the unique gifts that Lyme patients in particular have to offer in the world right now. Because I don't believe in coincidence anymore, and I believe that Lyme patients all over the world are, on one hand, the canaries in the coal mine who are just expressing an illness earlier than other people are, but they're also innovators. They're also people who are activating an aspect of their spirit at a deeper and more tangible level earlier as well. Because when you're pushed into the corner, you're marginalized, you're ignored, you're physically broken down, you have to dig down and find a different part of yourself, a deeper part of yourself, a spiritual part of yourself. You know, you're triggered to do that. And there's a gift in that. You know, even though none of us would wish our experience on another person, stranger or loved one, we have to, for our own healing, we have to find and embrace those aspects of this experience that are greater than the person that we were before we got sick. And if you visit our website, trekfortruth.org, you're going to see 3 people profiled on the homepage. One of which is a woman who took the trail name, as we call it in the hiking community, of Peace Pilgrim. And she's a very inspirational person to me personally. I came across her story when I was a very active member of another church here in this community, a Unity church, and I found her book, a book about her, in the bookstore at Unity of Louisville. Peace Pilgrim was the first woman, synchronistically, to ever hike the entire length of the Appalachian Trail. Her name at that time was her given name, Mildred Norman, and she was, I believe, 44 years old when she hiked this in 1952 with a friend of hers, a male friend of hers. One of the reasons she's not credited commonly with being the first woman to hike the entire 2,000+ mile trail was, at that time, it was a scandal, would be a scandal, to hike with a male counterpart that wasn't your husband. So she never gave her last name whenever they did newspaper interviews. It was so-and-so and Mildred. And they let people assume that they were married. But she did hike the whole thing, and she finished in October of 1952, I believe, could have been 53. And the following January 1, she changed her name, gave up all of her worldly possessions, took the name Peace Pilgrim, and began a 27-year pilgrimage, walking back and forth across the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, for peace. This was during the Korean War era, when the fear we had then collectively was nuclear holocaust. And she was a spiritual being called forth, like pilgrims have been called forth throughout history, to go and offer a different way of being. So she gave up all her worldly possessions, including money. She never used money again in her life for 27 years. Her philosophy was she would walk until she was given shelter, she would fast until she was given food, and she believed in the deep and innate and universal goodness of human beings. And she proved their goodness, that human nature, over and over again, because again, for 27 years, the only food that she ever ingested was food that was freely offered to her. The only shelter that she accepted was shelter that was freely offered to her. And she touched lives all over this country. And when I read that story, for whatever reason, it just struck something in me. This was about 2002 when I found out about her. So you'll see her story on her website. And for me, she embodies that spiritual aspect of healing. Because for 27 years, she basically owned her slacks, a shirt, a little tunic that she had made. It looked like an art teacher's smock that you would have had in middle school with the pockets in the front and the back. And she carried a pen, envelopes, and stamps and writing paper. Pre-internet, all of her correspondence was done by hand. It's the only thing she carried for all those years. But for 27 years, she writes about she was never sick a day in those 27 years, including days that she literally would sleep by the side of the road when she wasn't offered shelter, 12 months out of the year. Now, she didn't walk constantly. She walked 7 different pilgrimages over that period of time, but multiple times she went to every state in the United States. And so you'll see her story on there. The 2 other people that are profiled are someone you may have heard of. I know Lyme patients are going to be familiar with one of these names, but is everybody here somewhat familiar with Nikola Tesla? Mm-hmm. Nikola Tesla. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant genius, scientist of the early part of the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, up to about mid-1900s. So far ahead of his time, and so little known in our public education around the world and in the United States. In many ways, Einstein even used to write about how much he admired Tesla and how much he thought he was the genius of that era. But Tesla's work has not been as publicized as it should have been, as it by right, should be. Tesla, I'm going to paraphrase a very famous quote from him. He said, "If you wish to understand the nature of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." Energy, frequency, and vibration. And I'm going to talk about that when I'm going to talk about some tangible forms of healing that I experienced before I went on this adventure, and that became an even deeper experience for me on the adventure. Energy, frequency, and vibrations is something to keep in mind. The third person on the site, most people have never heard of, but Lyme patients have. And that's Royal Raymond Rife. So let me show of hands here. How many people know the name? Royal Raymond Rife. How many people really think they know the details of the story of his life? Most of us have heard about things called Rife machines, which are frequency generators that use basically sound frequencies to disable, devitalize, Rife used to call it, different pathogens. And what Rife's genius was, is he subscribed to a theory of disease that was competing back in the late 1800s with Pasteur's theory of disease. Pasteur's theory of disease being germ theory, that there are all these germs in the world and they randomly jump into people's bodies, cause an illness, and that theoretically you need an external cure to come in there and eradicate that illness when it overwhelms the immune system. There's a guy named, a contemporary of Louis Pasteur by the name of Antoine Beauchamp. He's a little bit older than Pasteur, and he was very revered in their mutual home country of France. Pasteur was a chemist, and Beauchamp was a biologist and kind of a multi-level scientist of the time. He was well loved because he helped eradicate a couple of pathogenic outbreaks that threatened the cattle industry and the milk industry in France at the time, and saved a lot of lives. His theory of disease at the time, he called it terrain theory. And in a nutshell, terrain theory basically means that the natural state of the human body is a state of equilibrium and health. It's the way nature designed it, just like it designs all other aspects of nature, to find an equilibrium, find a balance, and maintain a state of health. When it's knocked out of balance, it'll find a way to regain that. The terrain, in this case, would be the human body. And that when the terrain is clean, in the case of the human body, that you have adequate exercise, clean water, a clean environment, good food, low stress, loving relationships, all those things that keep us in balance. When that terrain is equalized like that, disease cannot take root. It's literally like taking a handful of seeds and going out in the parking lot and throwing them on the asphalt. Are they going to grow? No. It's the wrong terrain. And that a healthy terrain would not allow disease to propagate. Well, long story short, Pasteur's theory of disease won out. And it literally at the time was a political battle. And some very, very wealthy and powerful people got behind the science of Pasteur. And out of that emerged the allopathic model of medicine. Now, I'm not here to demonize allopathic medicine. There are some amazing things that have taken place healing-wise in allopathic medicine. Allopathic basically means, literally means the medicine of opposites. Germ, here, you need an opposite toxin to kill that germ. But it literally is about warfare. It's about killing things. And terrain theory is far from that. Well, Pasteur, ultimately won out, and that allopathic model was growing quickly and starting to become the predominant medical model by the time that Rife was doing the heart and soul of his research in the 1920s and 1930s. But Rife was trying, he really felt in his heart of heart that terrain theory was a much more holistic explanation of why disease can propagate and why it doesn't. The idea that if germ theory was true and all those germs exist all the time everywhere, then why aren't all of us sick all the time? So Rife, in his genius, he was an optical scientist. He got a PhD, an honorary one, from the University of Heidelberg, because his expertise was in optics, and he developed a microscope that was so far ahead of its time that to this day, the scientists of this era have still not been able to replicate the quality and the magnification power of the microscope he used. And the genius behind it was, instead of using chemical staining, so today microscopes, many times when they take tissue samples, they use a toxic chemical to provide contrast for the microscope to be able to see. And what it typically does is it kills the organism that they're looking at. Rife used to use the analogy, he said, killing the blood by staining it to look at it under a microscope and to be able to interpret something from it is like looking at a dead dog and trying to figure out what personality it had. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Rife, instead of using chemicals to produce the contrast, used light. His theory was that every single biological unit vibrated at a slightly different frequency. And what is light? Just another expression of frequency. You know, the electromagnetic spectrum, the different colors that we see, are just vibration made visual. That's all it is. So Rife came up with this ingenious way to use light as the staining agent, and he started to catalog, because this microscope was able to magnify things 100 times greater than the best microscope at that era. And he literally could see these living organisms. He could see viruses, which, you know, were theoretically, and to this day, are thought to be far too small to be able to really observe them with the naked eye. Now, even electron microscopes of this day, which are amazing pieces of technology, they still use radiation as a staining agent, and they kill the samples. So you don't see the actual organism living in its environment. Well, ultimately, Rife not only develops a microscope that allows him to start to prove the terrain theory of disease, because what he showed was when you could change the terrain, the agent that the culture for each one of these organisms to live in, you could actually change the organism. You could change a virus into a bacteria, a yeast into a fungi, and back and forth. And he was working with the very best medical doctors of the time out in California. He had a very wealthy patron who funded his lab. And he was able to get state-of-the-art equipment, and he was lauded, you know, as a remarkable breakthrough scientist at the time. There are photographs of him in the newspapers, I believe it was San Diego, at a dinner in his honor, because they were applauding him as potentially discovering the cure to all disease. Because he also developed this frequency generator. And through trial and error and good scientific method, he found a unique frequency for each organism that he discovered under the microscope, and he would match those frequencies up, and literally he would find a frequency that devitalized that entity, would literally prevent it from living any longer without damaging any of the surrounding tissue. And some of you all know this story, that in the mid-1930s, he, along with these doctors, conducted a clinic with 16 cancer patients who had all been told they were terminal. And that was, again, part of the protocol, is they weren't allowed to be enrolled in this trial unless traditional medicine had said, we throw in the towel. These people, we're sending them home to die. Kind of like the patients that go see Dr. Brzezinski now, if you're familiar with Stanislaw Brzezinski, who's doing some really amazing things down in Texas, but only is allowed to treat terminally ill patients that have already had chemotherapy and radiation. Well, Rife, over the course of about 90 days total, all 16 of those patients recover, and the best oncologists in that area were able to verify that there was no trace of cancer left in their body, no side effects from the treatments that they used. You know, really remarkable technology. So I share that because I got to meet a guy toward the end of this hike and bike, a guy named Saul Luckman, that, again, I don't believe in coincidence, and I believe part of the reason I felt called to go try this was I was ultimately going to meet this guy and find out more about his research. Saul's written a book that I bought and recently read, and he and I have become friends, and I met him through a friend of a friend. Saul had experienced 10 years of chronic illness. he had developed food allergies to the point where there was only a handful of foods he could eat without, terrible reaction to it. He was a young guy, he'd been a former college athlete, and this was about 2002, 2003 when he got to the height of his sickness and had been sick for about 10 years. And he began researching another area of healing that even goes beyond, I think, what Tesla was researching. And Saul, in his book, writes about three kind of categories of medicine. He calls one category Era 1 medicine. And that's what all of us are more familiar with, what you call biochemical medicine. Most of us in this room, most of our treatments have been at that level of healing. We have a biochemical syndrome, for lack of a better word, that our body's dealing with. And we've got biochemical substances to put into our body to try and offset that. Pills, injections, all kinds of things, but at the biochemistry level of healing. Well, what Saul points out, and Saul's not, unique in this era, this is really kind of the era of quantum science, quantum healing, quantum physics, and the level of frequency vibration, just like what Tesla was talking about. So let me toss out an example. When you have a thought, do we all acknowledge that a thought is a real thing? That it has tangibility? A thought can be measured electromagnetically. And we know now, most of us, especially Lyme patients, understand that our bodies are electromagnetic as well as biochemical. What Tesla was saying is we are electromagnetic first. That's an underlying level of reality, and the biochemistry evolves out of that. And it's exactly what happens when you have a thought. And scientists can measure this. You have a thought, negative or positive. You have an emotion typically that comes along with that thought. That's what the Buddhist meditation, that's what the principle of it is. That if you want to observe the way your state of mind affects your body in deep meditation, watch the subtle sensations in your body and know that those emotional reactions in your body are always preceded by a thought, most of which are subconscious. You don't consciously recognize that thought, but it's happening. And when that happens, that emotion is triggered, you have a biochemical reaction in your internal laboratory, and you start producing peptides and enzymes that flood into your body and produce a physical outcome. So electromagnetic first, biochemical after that. What Saul and quantum physics is talking about, and quite honestly, spirituality, is there's a level even beneath electromagnetism. The level of the spirit. And that the spirit is not solely just this esoteric, ethereal realm. It's real too. And the science of quantum healing is basically a different way of languaging what people have talked about spirituality for thousands of years. Just two languages to describe the same level of reality. So the way I met Saul was through a friend who had started an internet radio show with Saul. A woman by the name of Laura Walker.